the Gemara that we learned yesterday, we're speaking about the caper bush, continuation of the day before, and we were learning about the statement of Rabbi Yehuda Marav that the capers or caper berries of Arla, Slav shel Arla, in Chutz La'aretz, outside of Israel, we said you could throw the evyonis, the caper berries out because they're Arla, they're the first 3 years, but you would be allowed to eat the kafrisen. You would be allowed to eat the husks. The husk you would be allowed to eat. Again, we're talking about outside of Israel. And so the Gemara tried to figure out, why are the husks not included in the law of Arla, just like the caper berries? And the Gemara mentioned that, is it because the husks are not considered a fruit? But the bracha on the husks, we did say, is the bracha bare pri ha'etz, just like the caper berries. So the statement that was connected to our Gemara is all talking about brachas. And once we said that statement that the bracha on the kafrisen, which are the husks, is bare pri ha'etz, this created a problem with other halachas that which is now we're dealing with the laws of Arla, the first 3 years of the fruit. If it's a fruit, then you should seemingly need to wait 3 years also for the husks. And Rav, Yehuda said in the name of Rav, so Rav had said that no, just throw out the caper berries and you can eat the husks. Now, the Gemara answered that he holds like Rabbi Akiva. And the Rabbi Akiva is not even talking about Arla, and he's not talking about the laws of blessings. He's talking about a totally different case. He's talking about the laws of tithing. And the laws of tithing, Rabbi Akiva mentions over there that the only tithing you need to do is from the actual caper berry. You would be exempt from tithing the husks. Rabbi Eliezer, of course, argued on him. He said you got to take a meiser tithing from the husks and the caper berries and the other growths from it, called the capers. And Rabbi Akiva had argued. He says no, just the actual caper berry, but the husks you don't have to take meiser. So we are gonna try to say that Rabbi Yehuda said the name of Rab, the law, that outside of Israel, you're allowed to eat the husks, even if they're within the first 3 years. That opinion follows Rabbi Akiva's view, even though Rabbi Akiva spoke about Meiser, but it would have a impact on the laws of Arla as well, and allow one to eat the husks of the caper bush, even if they're within the first 3 years. And the Gemara then wanted to know, so why doesn't he say halacha ke Rabbi Akiva? If he's following Rabbi Akiva's view, why is he making it like it's his own view? And he should say, the halacha is like Rabbi Akiva. The Gemara says, no. You can't say the halacha is like Rabbi Akiva because it's only applicable outside of Israel, this law that we follow Rabbi Akiva, because you follow the lenient view outside of Israel. He has no intention to tell you that the halacha follows Rabbi Akiva inside Israel. Inside Israel, maybe the halacha follows Rabbi Eliezer. You have to be strict, but outside of Israel, you're allowed to follow the lenient view. And therefore, he can't say the halacha follows Rabbi Akiva, because then everyone would think, oh, even in Israel, you could follow Rabbi Akiva. And even if a tree is young within the first 3 years, you would think in Israel, you would be allowed to eat the husks, and that would not be true. And of course, the laws of Meiser would be the same. That if he says the halacha is like Rabbi Akiva, it would have an impact on the laws of Meiser in Israel. And all he's trying to say is that it should be lenient outside of Israel regarding these laws of Orla. So the Gemara then says, well, why don't we say that the halacha is like Rabbi Akiva in Chutz La'aretz? Let him say clearly, I follow Rabbi Akiva, and I follow him specifically outside of Israel. And the Gemara says, if you would say that, we would think that the halacha follows him regarding Meiser. And the reason why it would follow him regarding Meiser would be because regarding Meiser, there you would think Meiser, the tithing in Israel itself, is only rabbinic on fruits that are not grapes or olives, on fruit trees that are not grapes or olives. So you wouldn't.
Rabbi, there's some back talk, and some people are not muted. Please.
So there's reason to think that if the halacha would follow Rabbi Akiva outside of Eretz Yisrael, outside of Israel, if we would say the halacha follows Rabbi Akiva, we would think that that law applies to Meiser, but Arla maybe it would not apply. What does that mean? Meiser means tithing. Arla means the first 3 years. So you would think that the law follows Rabbi Akiva. Again, Rabbi Akiva's point is that what is considered a fruit? Only the caper berry, not the husks. That's the main point that we're getting from Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva said his law regarding the Meiser, but that law would have an effect, an impact on other laws as well, on Arla, on the blessing maybe. But in the meantime, we're talking about the laws of Meiser. So if we would say that the halacha follows Rabbi Akiva outside of Israel, people will think that only regarding Meiser that applies, because Meiser tithing itself is only rabbinic, even in Israel, of any tree that's not the grapevine or the olive tree. And therefore, the capers, you would say, well, they're only rabbinic in Israel. Therefore, outside of Israel, we can follow Rabbi Akiva, because even in Israel, it's only rabbinic. Therefore, there's more leniency. However, Arla, which is the first 3 years of a fruit tree, that in Israel will be biblical, even on a caper bush. And therefore, you would say outside of Israel, maybe we should be strict. And therefore, Rabbi Yehuda Marav did not say the halacha follows Rabbi Akiva outside of Israel. He said, you're allowed to eat the caper husks, outside of Israel. And he didn't say the halacha follows Rabbi Akiva outside of Israel. He said you're allowed to eat the caper husks outside of Israel. This way, it was very clear that even regarding Arla, you can follow that view of Rabbi Akiva that considers the caper husks not a fruit and would be exempt from the laws of Arla. So that was the initial issue with Rav's statement. The Gemara is not satisfied. The Gemara has other questions. And the Gemara then asks that, brings a brisa. And this brisa itself was a little hard to understand, seemed like a contradiction in it itself. So first we have to answer the actual brisa, the contradiction within the brisa itself, and then we can connect it to our discussion. So what did the brisa say? The brisa was talking about the caper bush, and it mentioned that Beis Shammai holds it is considered kilayim. Kilayim means it is considered a mixture, a forbidden mixture. And what does that mean? That if you mix the caper bush and you plant it in a vineyard, that would be called a forbidden mixture. We mentioned that maybe you need to have two vegetables inside a vineyard to be forbidden, or 2 grains inside a vineyard to be forbidden. But basically, the caper bush would be considered a vegetable, according to Beis Shammai, and it would be considered a prohibition to be planted inside a vineyard obviously we're talking about close to other vines, and therefore it would be considered like a mixture, and it would be considered if anything grows from the two, would end up being prohibited for benefit, would be called kilayim, this forbidden mixture. So we have to be careful on a vineyard not to plant grain or vegetables. And and Beis Shammai tells us that the caper bush would be considered part of that prohibition, kilayim b'kerem. Beis Hillel said, no, capers are a tree. It's not a vegetable. And therefore, it is not a problem of being planted in a vineyard. Now, both of them agree, however, that you do have to wait 3 years for capers. So even Beis Shammai, who says it's a vegetable, you have to wait 3 years before you can eat the capers. Now, or caper berries or whatever. The caper bush needs 3 years. He doesn't clarify exactly, but he says the caper bush would need to worry, you would need to be concerned about arla. Now, that itself is a contradiction. If it's a vegetable, you should not need to be worried about the 3-year time frame. You don't have to worry about that period of 3 years, because vegetables don't have the rule of leaving a tree to grow for 3 years. That's only on a tree. Va'araltem or losai espirioi, you would need to leave a tree for 3 years and not benefit from the produce of the tree for the first 3 years. That's called arla. That applies to a tree, not to vegetables. And therefore, it's a contradiction what Beis Shammai says. On the one hand, he says it's called kilayim. If you put it in a vineyard, it would be considered a forbidden mixture. Sounds like it's a vegetable. On the other hand, he says you have to wait 3 years. Sounds like it's a fruit tree. If you have to wait 3 years, sounds like a fruit tree. So that itself, so the Gemara asked, this is a contradiction. So the Gemara answered, it's not a problem. It's not a contradiction. Really, we're trying, Beis Shammai is unsure. If you're unsure, then you got to follow both stringencies. You got to follow the stringency of maybe it's a fruit tree. You got to wait 3 years. Oh, maybe it's considered a vegetable because it's low. It's growth. It's a very low growing bush, and therefore it would be considered possibly a vegetable. On the other hand, it might be a fruit tree. So you got to wait 3 years because it may be a fruit tree. You got to be worried about kilayim, the forbidden mixture, in a vineyard because it might be considered a vegetable. Now, what comes out is that according to Beis Shammai, what is the caper bush? Is it considered arla? Is it definite arla or a maybe arla? Is it a definite problem of eating its fruits within the first 3 years, or is it a maybe a potential issue of eating its fruits in the first 3 years? Again, there is a concept of being strict, which Beis Shammai is over here. He's strict, not because he's sure, but because he's unsure. And when you're unsure, sometimes you have to take on extra stringencies. And Beis Shammai is saying that I am not sure that this is a vegetable. It might be a fruit tree. I'm not sure it's a fruit tree. It might be a vegetable. Therefore, he says you got to be strict on both ends. And he says you got to be careful not to eat the fruit within the first 3 years. However, keep in mind that sometimes when you're not sure, there are leniencies. Because let's say, for example, on rabbinic laws, sometimes if you're not sure about it, you could be more lenient, depending on the scenario. But there are leniencies when you're not sure. Something that's definite, of course, is a problem. Something that you're unsure about, you might be able to find leniencies. I'll give you an example. Friday afternoon, after the sun sets, there is a time period that we are not sure if it's day or night. There's a time called Bein Hashmashos. In between the period of day and night, there's a gray area. We don't know, is it considered day or night? And there are certain leniencies during that time period. If a person is in an emergency situation, they can rely on that leniency. For example, a person arrived, flight came in late, and it's within the first 10 minutes or 15 minutes after sunset. And in such a scenario, there's definitely room to be lenient and to, if you can make it home to make it home. Otherwise, you'll be stuck, who knows, stranded. So that would be within the first. There is leniencies, and I'm not giving you a blanket exemption, but there are leniencies during this gray area because it's questionable if it's, it's questionable if it's really, if it's Shabbos yet, if it's night, if it's not definitely night. There are different opinions as well. There's also, there's a famous opinion of Rabbeinu Tam that the night doesn't really begin till a while later. So there's definitely room. There are different opinions within that. There's definitely room to be a little lenient in cases of great necessity. And of course, being stuck in the airport for Shabbos would definitely be something of, would definitely be considered very extremely uncomfortable, especially if there are kids, definitely an issue. Then you might not have food or whatever. So there's definitely room to be lenient in such a scenario. So in any event, the point here is that we have a suffix arla. Beis Shammai says, I'm not sure if this is a tree. Now that that possibility that Beis Shammai holds gives us room for leniency outside of Israel. Because outside of Israel, you can be lenient when something that you're not sure about with regard to Arla, regard to the first 3 years. So the point that the Gemara is bringing is that this is based on a story. The story was Ravina found Mar bar Ravashi, found the son of Ravashi eating the husks of the caper bush, and he wasn't eating the caper berries. And the Ravina told him, he says, you know what, I can find you a leniency. You can even eat the caper berries because we're not in Israel. We're outside of Israel. And as long as there's room for leniency, you can rely on that. That's the rule. Anything with regard to the laws of Arla, the first 3 years outside of Israel, you can be very lenient as long as you're not sure that it's from the first 3 years. So for example, if you find a tree and you want to eat, and you're not sure if it's first 3 years or not, you would be allowed to eat from that tree outside of Israel. You don't have to check. You don't have to look into it. Outside of Israel, you can be lenient, Arla. Here also, Beis Shammai is not sure if the caper bush is considered a tree. Might be a vegetable. Vegetable doesn't need to have Arla. You don't have to wait 3 years. He says, okay, I have the opinion of Beis Shammai says that there's unclarity about the caper bush, means it might be a vegetable. That's good enough for me to rely on and eat even the caper berries within the first 3 years because it might be a vegetable. So if someone comes to me and says, how dare you eat the caper berries? It's the first 3 years. This is a tree that's Arla. You could answer him, no. Beis Shammai holds it might be questionable if it's a vegetable, and I'm allowed to rely on that that suffix. It's called that I don't know how to translate it. A suffix, this area of question. I can rely on that. Might be a vegetable. Doubt. I'm allowed to rely on that because we're not in Israel. That doubt. That doubt. Yeah, that doubt. Uncertainty. Thank you. That uncertainty, that doubt would be, I'm allowed to rely on outside of Israel. And that was Ravina's advice to Mar bar Ravashi. Look, you got I'm giving you a good heter, a good leniency. Yes, Ben.
Yeah, I always wondered about the word Ben Hashmashot. Is that between the sun and the moon? The time between the sun and the moon? The two, are they calling it two?
You want to know the etymology of the word? I have to look it up. I don't know. Literally, Shmashdot sounds like the suns, between the suns, but I don't know.
Between the sun and the moon would be, no, Shemesh is the sun.
I don't know. I don't know. I have to look in at etymological dictionary.
Otherwise, I was thinking, what about tomato? Is that a tree or a bush or a vegetable or what?
Right. I mean, we recite the bracha bar priya adam on it.
Okay.
But the question would be, in Israel, are they careful to wait 3 years? And I doubt it. But
yeah, no, tomato is a seasonal thing, yeah.
The tomatoes grow back every year, or do you have to replant them?
No,
they grow back.
I mean, you have to seed it. You grow new ones from the seeds. every year.
So if you don't do anything, they're not going to grow back?
No. Well, they
So
go
that
back because the seeds are falling on the ground, and then the seeds will grow in a bush.
Uh-huh. So it sounds like a vegetable.
Yeah, but some people say it's a fruit, so I don't know.
Have you ever grown tomatoes?
Oh yeah, many times.
Uh-huh. Okay, because Susan wants to argue with you. Susan, what would you like to say?
It's considered a fruit in scientific, whatever, they consider it a fruit.
That's what I'm
well,
saying.
we're not worried about the scientific view. We want to know.
Some of the vines, I just planted some tomatoes from seeds that the vines have tomatoes every year, and I don't have to replant them. It's a specific.
Now that's interesting.
It's a hybrid. It's a purple tomato, and they come back every year.
That's very interesting. I wonder if that might
Does
change
the bush
rule.
come back, or the fruit comes back on the old?
The fruit comes back. The fruit comes back.
Oh, okay, so the bush is not seasonal.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay.
Here in Panama, they sell tomatoes from a tree.
Uh-huh. What does that
Yeah,
mean?
they're big trees.
They grow from a big tree?
There's some kind that they're not from a vine, but they're from a tree. That's the best I can tell you.
Take
I
a
don't pay
picture for
attention
us.
to them. All right, well, I will do that. I promise.
Okay. So that's interesting. This is very interesting. I wonder what these cases would be, because there might be we don't mix seeds from other vegetables and fruits, but people do that. And I wonder what would be the final, what would be the rule with regard to the laws of Arla if they somehow do that and
Well,
mix the seeds.
Today, some tomato bushes grow 6-7 feet high.
Uh-huh.
They are supported with sticks and wires and whatever.
Right. Right.
So, Rabbi,
But-
here's a
yeah.
question for you.
Yeah.
Let's assume that that Susan's tomato is a cross between two different
Fruit and a vegetable.
No, between two varieties of tomatoes. That would be okay, correct?
It might be. There is a question, like with regard to citrus fruits. Are all citrus fruits considered one type? I'm not sure I can answer that, because I don't know for sure, but I'm just telling you there are laws about these things. Like, do we consider it all one? I'm not sure. I don't know. You know what I mean? In other words, for a Jew to do that, would a Jew be allowed to crossbreed between different varieties to maybe, I don't know. Do we consider, is there any rule with regard to what's considered like one or not? No, because someone had a question once about us. We're watering these trees. A lot of them are crossbreeds, so we are maybe transgressing. So one of the opinions said, no, it's not a problem, because they're all considered like one type. And I think that was regarding citrus, but I wonder if that would apply to, in general, maybe to each type. Like tomatoes are tomatoes, but I don't know if that would apply if you start mixing a crossbreeding of a fruit and a vegetable. Would be another, that would probably be a whole another category. Yeah, but anyway, we have to look into these things. I'm not sure. I have to check it out. Yes, Susan.
I said an hybrid. I didn't mean hybrid. I meant heirloom. It's an heirloom tomato. That's what was on the package.
Does that explain where it's for how
Heirloom means that it's from seeds from a long time ago, from the 20s and 30s.
Right.
That's what heirloom implies. Whether or not it's truth, I don't know. That I can't say.
Well, it might be a crossbreed from them. In other words, they
Correct.
might have done the
Exactly.
crossbreeding.
Exactly. And so, but
Right.
I don't know.
Right. Okay. Okay.
So
Okay.
then-
So anyway, yeah.
So-
I'm
so
sorry. Answer.
Rabbi, so if it is a crossbreed,
Right.
do we have an answer at all?
An answer about what?
Well, because her crossbreed produces, annually it reproduces. Okay.
Right.
Whereas, when the rabbis are discussing all these things, I don't think there was any such thing at the time. And so therefore they may have given a law based upon the situation that existed at that time. So what happens in situations where things change?
Right. No, I believe I believe they knew very well about crossbreeding, probably even better than us. All we care about now is the GM genetically modified stuff. That's all they care about now. Forget about the crossbreeding. They just want to multiply them by. But the crossbreeding in those days, that was that was a way of strengthening the tree and making it stronger. I'm sure it's discussed. I just happen not to. I just don't know. You stumped me. I'll have to
In
look
the
it up.
citrus, they do grafting. So they take a
Right.
tree that has strong roots and healthy roots, it doesn't get sick, and they graft on an orange or clementine or whatever you want.
Yeah, no, for sure. But I'm sure they knew about it. It was called. I mean, there's a famous word. There are two ways they used to do it. There's something called havracha and harkava. Two
Harkava
different
is
ways.
grafting.
Right, but havracha is also some
I
way
don't know
of
what it is.
that they would bend the branch down to the ground and let it grow from the
Take
somehow
root.
it would grow from that branch. Another tree would grow from it. So there were two types. There was two types. It's been mentioned in the Mishnah. I mean, they knew very well about harkava and havracha. These two words that throughout the entire Talmud. They're they're numerous times. But so I'm sure it's discussed. I'm just not sure of what the rule is regarding Orla. I'm sure it would be mentioned in the Rambam. I'm sure Maimonides would mention it. We could definitely look it up. I just don't want to take your time. So I'll take a look at Mitzvah Shem afterwards. Okay, so in any event, the story here is that they asked that this Ravina asked Mar Baravashi what the law would be in regarding this. Ravina asked why you being so strict. You could be lenient and follow Beis Shammai. So his answer was that if I want to follow Rabbi Akiva instead of Rabbi Eliezer, that I can do. But I can't follow Beis Shammai instead of Beis Hillel, because Beis Shammai is not considered a view when you have his view is not acceptable. So you can't rely on that. So he might have an unclarity, a doubt, uncertainty with regard to the laws of the caper bush. If it's a fruit or a vegetable, I can't rely on that, on his doubt, on his uncertainty. I can rely on Beis Hillel. I can even rely on Rabbi Akiva instead of Rabbi Eliezer. And therefore, I'm following Rabbi Akiva because Rabbi Akiva has a leniency that the caper husks. The husks are not considered a fruit that I can eat here outside of Israel, even if it's a young tree, the first few years, because they're not considered fruits. But with regard to relying on Beis Shammai and eating the actual caper berries, that I can't do. So that's the story. Now, what comes out is that with regard to brachas, we mentioned that the bracha on the husk would be ha'etz, bari pri ha'etz. And we had a problem that why outside of Israel would you be allowed to eat the husks? And they answered that we follow we follow Rabbi Akiva that you could be lenient. And the reason for this leniency is because we're considering it not a fruit. Now, if we consider it not a fruit, it would be interesting, and this is an interesting question, and I'm just going to throw it out there because I just think that you might enjoy the question. If you're eating a fruit, if you're eating the husk of the capers, think about this. You're going to eat the husk of the capers within the first 3 years. Now, why are you allowed to do that? Because we're relying on Rabbi Akiva that it's not a fruit, right? So you're eating it because you're allowed to. It's outside of Israel. It's not a fruit. You could follow Rabbi Akiva. What bracha are you saying on it? Pri ha'etz, who creates the fruit of the tree? Because regarding the bracha, we're not going to follow that leniency. Regarding the bracha, we're going to claim it's a fruit. Now, isn't that like a contradiction? If it's really a fruit, and I'm saying a bracha pri ha'etz, isn't that a contradiction? How am I eating it? It's within the first 3 years. If I'm claiming it's a fruit, I'm saying a bracha with Hashem's name. Would that be a contradiction in terms? I'm eating a fruit within the first 3 years, and the reason I'm allowed to eat it is because I'm claiming it's not really a fruit. According to Rabbi Akiva, it's not really a fruit. Well, if it's not really a fruit, how am I saying bracha bar priyatz? Is that considered like a tarti desasri, like a contradiction in terms? That's just an interesting question to throw out there. You can think about it. Yes, Ben.
I thought about it from the beginning. I thought it shouldn't be called a fruit, the husk. It should be called shahako.
Yeah, but the Gemara says, you recite the Gemara had clearly told us that you say the Bari Priya Eitz.
Yeah, but it's the plant itself. It's not the fruit.
What is that?
It's part of the plant itself. It's not the fruit.
Well, the way the Gemara understands it is somehow it grows with the fruit and then it does fall off. But it's considered to be, the Gemara understands it to be part of the fruit. It's like a portion of the fruit that does fall off. At least that's the way the Gemara seems to understand it.
Yeah.
I mean, and even with regard to fruits, Rabbi Eliezer also says regarding the laws of Arla, Rabbi Eliezer also holds that it's a fruit. So it's not totally wrong. So
yeah.
Rabbi Eliezer says about the laws of Meiser. The laws of Meiser. He holds it's considered a it's considered a fruit. You got to tithe it, right? He says you tithe the kafrisen. He says you got to tithe it. Sounds like it's a okay. Who has a question? Susan, yes.
Okay, in the Steinsaltz, it talks that the handle is not food.
That's the next Gemara.
Okay, sorry.
So then the Gemara mentioned that the issue of the fact that it is a guard, that it's a shell, and the shell of a fruit it's called a shomer. It's a guard. It guards the fruit. It's safety for the fruit, and the shell should be considered included in the laws of Arla. And so the Gemara says that even if you don't want to consider it a fruit, but the fact is it's a shell, and the shell would be also prohibited as part of the laws of Arla. And why are we going to say that we could be lenient and eat the shells of the caper bush? The shells also are considered Arla, even if it's not a fruit. because it falls into the category of a guard for the fruit. Guards of the fruits are included. And that Gemara said we learned from the word es. There's a word es, ve'araltem or losai es period, an extra word. The Gemara says es means something secondary, and that includes something that's a guard for the fruit. So, the skin, the husk, this outer peel is considered it's considered a guard, and it should be included in the laws of Arla, is because it's hinted to in that verse. S, the word S hints to it, and therefore it should be prohibited because of that.
Rabbi,
Yes.
like in times of famine, people will just about eat anything. So I'm just thinking, if a person ate a banana peel or a peanut shell, would that be the bracha
Different
of
bracha. You're wondering if it would have a different bracha. Do the laws change in times of
Right.
famine?
Well, no. I'm just saying, because of the fact in times of famine, people would eat a banana peel or a peanut shell if that's all they had. Would those brachas be? Would they say a bracha of Borei Pri Hadama because they're eating the shell, like the husk, is similar to the caper husk?
Right. So what it boils down to is that there's a concept of foods that are eaten al yedei hadchak, like in a you don't have anything else, you eat it. But then there's foods that are really inedible, and even those things you would eat. That's a whole different category. You know what I mean? Like during famine, you'll eat stuff that's not even, it's not even in the category of food, and that would be a different story. But something that you don't have anything else. Like people don't like sardines, but they'll eat it when they don't feel like going to the store. They'll pull it out of their cabinet and eat it. So certain things, like our Gemara gave a case of eating barley flour, right? We learned about barley flour, but the Gemara made it pretty clear that it's very rare that a person is going to eat it. The barley flour is quite uncommon, but a person might eat, or salt. A person doesn't just eat salt, but the Gemara mentions that that's like a food that you would consider eating. So I don't know if you can eat a peanut, the peanut husk when it's I don't know how edible it is. I know people choke on them, but there are foods that are considered somewhat in that category that you're thinking of, and that our Gemara mentioned before about the barley that you would recite a shahakol, and if you remember correctly. And we also spoke about eating raw, a raw gourd, akara chaya. So we mentioned these foods. They're obviously not normally eaten, and yet there are brachas to be said. But you don't recite the you don't recite the regular bracha. Again, this was a gourd, which is like a pumpkin that's not cooked. If it was cooked, you would recite the regular bracha. Here, it's not cooked. You say the shahakol. So the same thing would apply probably to other similar things, that if it's normally cooked but you can't cook it, things like that, you would recite a shahakol. Yeah, it's a bit broad in Shulchan Aruch that as well.
So if a person ate, again, a person's very hungry, there's limited food. If a person ended up eating an orange peel,
right. We're going to talk about some of these things. We're going to talk about the peels.
In terms of the caper or peel, the husk.
Right.
Okay.
Right. Well, the problem is it's hard for us to relate to because we don't know exactly how the caper husk tastes and feels, the texture. We're not so familiar, at least I'm not. And so, it's hard to compare it to is it like a banana peel? Is it like a walnut shell? What is it? What exactly does it taste like? What is it? So again, we're talking about foods that we don't, most people aren't so familiar with. But whatever it is, it does seem like it is edible, and to the extent that we're calling it part of the fruit and reciting a Borei Pri Ha'etz. At the same time, you do have opinions with regard to regard to Meiser. Do you separate Meiser from it? So maybe it's not really so edible. You know, it seems like it's somewhere in that gray area because Rabbi Akiva holds one thing and Rabbi Eliezer holds another thing. So it is somewhere in that gray area. But I wish I could tell you what it tastes like. I don't know.
Tastes like chicken.
Yes, Robert.
I just wanted to, again, follow up. You said something about eating an orange peel. And I'm trying to figure out the association because when one bakes, one uses what is called orange zest, which is the scraping of the orange peel for part of the flavor of the product. Yeah.
It's definitely edible.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
At least somewhat edible. Yeah. Even though most people don't go around eating the orange peel.
Right.
Yeah, we're going to be talking about it. We are going to pick some cases over here about the peels and so on. So we'll try to cover some of this. Again, we have 10 pages to go through before we really get get the full picture here. So we got to sit back and keep our hold some of the questions. Yes, Ben.
Yeah, I wanted to say about the peels. The banana, the orange, the peanut, they're all harvested with the peel or with the shell. I don't know about capers, but the orange, you make candy from the peel,
right?
Which you're eating basically peel. In the peanut, the only way.
What bracha do you think should be said on the peel of orange peel?
Right.
What bracha?
I'm not an authority on bracha, but I can tell you the peanut. You can only eat them the first couple days or the first day that it's pulled out of the ground, because it's pulled out of the ground with the peel and it's soft.
Right.
But the minute it dries out, no, you can't eat it with a peel.
So you've eaten peanut peels?
You can.
Have you eaten peanut peels?
Well, when you are pulling it out of the ground, you can wash it off and eat a couple. Yeah, but it's not normal to eat it.
I've eaten peanut peels because it makes great roughage.
Fiber.
It scratches your gut.
Fiber, right? Exactly what it is. It's rough. It's fiber.
Okay. So, because we're going to talk about walnut peels soon. So, okay, very good. In any event, the Gemara had asked about the peel would seem to be prohibited because of the laws of Arla, because it is a shield for the fruit, and even if it's not a fruit itself, it would still be prohibited. Now, the Gemara answered that it's only Rava answered that it's only when it if the shield for the fruit, if it stays around even after it's harvested. And here the caper husk falls off before you harvest it. It's not attached to the fruit when it's harvested, and therefore it's not considered included in this law of Arla. So what comes out from here would be that you would be allowed to eat the caper husk. But the Gemara is not satisfied. The Gemara now asks another question. That's where we're up to. Esvei, we're on page 36b. And we are maybe about 8 lines from the top of the page. 36b. 36b, 8 lines from the top of the page. Esvei Abaye. Abaye asked a question. And here we're talking about the laws of giving off. Well, we'll soon see. Here we're mentioning pitma shel rima. We're talking about the laws of a pomegranate, first of all. And the top of the pomegranate has different. The top of the pomegranate has two things that grow. There's a pitum and the nates. The pitum of the pomegranate is Rashi over here. it's on the top of the pomegranate, and the nates grows around it. So I don't really know pomegranates that well, but I think the pitum would be like the inner protrusion that goes up, and the nates would be more like a crown, I think there's like a little crown around the pomegranate. So that's what it seems like, and we're going to talk about both of those. If they're considered to be the shomer, the guard for the fruit, are they considered the guard? So here it says, Esvei Abaye asked Rava a contradiction. How could you make a differentiate between something that's attached to the fruit when it's attached, something that's there when it's attached to the ground, or if it's there after you harvest it? We're going to see that that's wrong, Abaye says, from the laws of the pomegranate. Because what happens with the laws of the pomegranate? Pitma shall remain, when you have the pitum, that top protrusion from a pomegranate, mitzdarefes, it can join together to be a shear, to be a measurement of an egg size with the remain with the pomegranate, and this would create a law of giving off impurity. And the idea of the shomer, the guard, is that it helps protect the fruit. Anything that helps protect the fruit, it is considered like attached to it. And then there's laws of things that you hold the fruit with. If there's a part of the fruit that you hold it by, and these are laws of impurity. Now, the law with regard to something that's a shomer, it has a special law that it could help the measurement. There needs to be a measurement of an egg size in order to make other things impure. So a pomegranate that's small, so it's not the size of an egg, would you be able to include the pitum in the nates with it? Would that be allowed to be included to make it be able to make something else impure? So the Mishnah says, Pitma shall remain. You have this pitum of the remain, you have this top little protrusion of the pomegranate, together with the mitzdarefes, it joins together to make a size of an egg. And the outer protrusion around the pomegranate, and which falls off when the pomegranate is ripe, if it doesn't join together to be a guard for the pomegranate. So there's a difference between the pitum and the nates. Now the nates does fall off, and it falls off before it gets ripened. Before it's ripened, that nates that we're talking about, again, maybe I'm wrong then. Maybe it's not the crown. Maybe it's something else that grows around it. But somehow there's a piece that falls off before it's ripe, and that's what the Mishnah says. That the Mishnah in Uktzin, it's a Mishnah in the Mishnayos. It says that the nates does not count towards that kibetza, towards that egg size, in order to make something else impure. So Midka Amar, Abaye says, since it says Hanetz shalai einay mitzdaref, that the nates is not included, Alma delav oichel. Obviously, we don't consider the nates food, and if it would be considered food, it would be included with the pomegranate. Obviously, the nates is not considered food, and that nates would be similar to the husk of a caper. Utnan, and we learned in the Mishnah regarding Gabe Arla, Klipe Rimoin Vahanetz Shaloi, when you have the nates, first of all, the skin of the pomegranate and the nates, which is this protrusion on the top that falls off, Klipe Agoizim, or if you have a walnut shell, vehagarinin, and the seeds of other fruits, chayavin bi'arla, they are chayiv in arla, and you would be obligated to keep the laws of arla even for these items. And what this means is that why are you obligated in keeping arla, but it's not attached to be considered the right size of an egg with regard to the laws of impurity? So since it's considered fruit with regard to arla, but it's not considered food regarding the laws of impurity, it must mean that it's not really a food even regarding the laws of arla. It's only obligated in arla because of a side reason. It's considered a shomer. It's considered a guard for the fruit. And so therefore the nates, which is this outer protrusion that falls off, that is considered part of the shomer of the pomegranate. Now, because it's a guard for the pomegranate, it would have the law of arla. You got to keep. Now, how does that help? What does that tell us? This tells us that the same thing would apply to the husk of the caper. Now we've got a little clarity here that, or actually a question, because what we said before, that the caper, because the husk of the caper falls off, the husk of the caper berry falls off when you, it's not there when you harvest it. Because of that, it's considered, it's not considered to be a guard because it's not there when you harvest it. Well, what about the nates is also not there when you harvest it. And therefore, and still we consider it arla. So the Gemara is going back and saying, how can you eat the husks of the caper fruit? So the Gemara answers, Elo Amar Rava, Heicha Amrina Danasa La Shomer Lapri. When do we say that it's considered a guard for the fruit? Heicha de Isa B'Shas Gmar Peira. That's only, we only say that it's a guard for the fruit if it's there at the end of when it's ripened. High kafras lessa, this kafras is not there at the end. B'shas gemar pei, high kafras lessa b'shas gemar pei. It's not there when it's fully ripened. The kafras falls off, and because of that, it would not be considered a shomer, a guard. And what it sounds like is that the nates of the pomegranate, maybe stays on afterwards, and therefore it would be considered a chayiv and arla. Now the Gemara asks, Eini, is this so? The Amar Rav Nachman Amar Rabba bar Ravua. What about another case? Hani mesachal. What about the outer shell of the dates? There's also that case. In other words, we're comparing cases to the caper. And what about that shell, the arla, when it's within 3 years? The Rav Nachman Amar Rabba bar Ravua, Rav Nachman said in the name of Rabba bar Ravua that these shells of the dates within the first 3 years, he said asiri, they would be prohibited because they become a shomer, because they are considered a guard for the fruit. And the shomer laperi emashavi. When is it considered a guard for the fruit? Bekufra, when they're young, before they're ripe. V'kakarele shomer lapri, and we're calling it a guard. So we're going back to square one and saying the caper husks should not be allowed to be eaten if they're within the first 3 years. So we're back and forth. Rav Nachman Sava like Rav Yosi. The Gemara answered that Rav Nachman holds like Rav Yosi, that the fruit even before it's considered ripened, it's considered a fruit. And therefore, that's why Rav Nachman has his stringency. But really, we don't necessarily agree with it. The rabbis argue on this. Ditnan, because we learned in a Mishnah, Rabbi Yossi Amar Smadar. Rabbi Yossi says grapes, before they're ripened, immediately after the blossom falls off, that is already called a grape, and it's usher b'mneshu pri. It's considered a fruit. You're not allowed to eat it even at that stage, and that's called a fruit. Upligi rabbanan alei, but the rabbis argue. So because he holds that that's called a fruit, therefore the cover, the husk, is also called a fruit. But the rabbis really argue on that. They say that's not considered a fruit, and therefore the husks would not be considered a guard to the fruit because it's not a fruit. And the guard, and if they fall off beforehand, it's not, if it's not there when they're ripened. In other words, this is the logic. The logic is that the caper berries are not ripe yet. They're not ripe yet. That's not considered a guard for the fruit because it's not a fruit yet. Only after they're ripe is it considered a fruit, and then the caper husks would be considered a guard for the fruit. But if they fall off before the fruit is ripe, it's not a guard for the fruit. Therefore, it's not a problem, and you don't have to follow the laws of Orla. But this is still not satisfactory because the Gemara has another question on this. The only thing is it's 11 o'clock. So we're going to stop here, and hopefully we'll finish this Gemara on Sunday. I want to wish you all a very good Shabbos. Sei gesund.